now for the exchange and what we should be watching for in the coming days. We're joined by Alina Polyakova. She is the president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. Alina, first, your reaction to the president there speaking to CNBC this morning, saying that the lower oil prices go, perhaps putting more pressure on those countries that purchase Russian oil, that will possibly have an impact on President Putin and his decision as to whether or not he is ready for a ceasefire deal. What do you make of that?
Well, the president is certainly right that Russia is very much dependent on oil, but also gas exports that really fuels its war machine and now its war economy. But there's a really important unintended consequence here of threatening some of Russia's largest buyers, which are now India and China, of Russian oil, with secondary sanctions, meaning that we would stop doing deals with these large countries and likely risk our own trade relationships, both with India and China, if we did so, is that would actually raise global oil prices if suddenly we have such major disruption. India stopped buying Russian oil, China stopped buying Russian oil. I don't think these things are very likely, but the very clear consequence would not be lower oil prices, which would hurt the Russian economy. It would likely be higher oil prices, which would likely benefit the Russian economy.
Yes, because so much of the Russian economy has for so long depended on its sale of oil and natural gas. We know that Russia's economy for the last few years especially has been on a wartime footing now. And we have this visit from Steve Witkoff. I would imagine that he wouldn't be going if there wasn't a meeting scheduled with President Putin, but I could be proven wrong. The last time they met, it was a very welcoming and warm reception that he received, and he spoke glowingly. Witkoff did of Putin after the fact, even bringing home a portrait that he says President Putin had made after that assassination attempt for President Trump. Now that Trump's rhetoric has changed towards Vladimir Putin, what, if anything, do you expect to come out of this meeting other than perhaps another symbolic gesture?
Well, Putin is very famous for constantly keeping people guessing, being, egregiously late to meetings, canceling meetings in the last minute. This is part of his power play that he uses, quite effectively and quite frequently. So there's no guarantee that Witkoff will get that meeting. He may or may not. I think the change this time versus the last time that Witkoff was in Moscow is likely going to be much less of a red carpet being rolled out for him. We certainly saw that last time. The Russians did a charm offensive, and I think Witkoff reciprocated with a similar charm offensive, as you just said, Bianna. And I think the situation he'll face now is probably going to be more of a serious conversation, whether that's with Putin or with one of his aides, about Russia's strategic intentions in Ukraine. And to be clear, those strategic intentions have not changed since President Trump took office. They are still to fully control Ukraine, whether that's by force or through complete political capitulation of President Zelensky.
And meantime, Ukraine is experiencing more territorial losses. It has been a rough few months for them on the battlefield on the front there. Can't sugarcoat the difficulty that they have been facing. They constantly are being innovative, the Ukrainians, in their drone production. We mentioned that phone call between President Zelensky and President Trump. President Zelensky clearly now an expert in knowing how to appeal to the areas of interest for President Trump, and that is deal making and suggesting that the two can cooperate on drone production. But drones alone won't get Ukraine to victory. What more do the Ukrainians need? And on the flip side, what actually would worry Vladimir Putin enough to bring him back to the negotiating table just from a military standpoint?
No, that's right, Bianna. Unfortunately, the last 3 months, Ukraine has seen some of the biggest losses of territory that it has seen, over the last 3.5 years. Russia controls now about 20% of Ukrainian territory, occupies that. In the last month, just in July alone, they gained about 500 square kilometers, which is not insignificant. So the Russian offensive is working. They're throwing everything they have in the war against Ukraine, and they're banking on the idea that Ukrainian defenses are going to break because Ukraine will lose support from its allies, particularly the United States. So you're right, Ukraine cannot fight this war just with drones, although they have proven to be incredibly innovative. There's a reason why President Trump is likely interested in this potential drone deal, is because this is the way that Ukraine can make the United States a more competitive, more innovative, more defense and fighting ready force with their IP, with their innovation, frankly, that we simply don't have in our military capabilities. But all of this is just not enough. The sanctions that President Trump has threatened, that potentially the deadline expires at the end of this week, the Russians are banking that they can basically weather that storm. What we really need is a full military pressure campaign combined with economic and political pressure campaign on Russia to really change Putin's calculus. Militarily, what that means is Ukraine needs a lot more air defense capabilities. From the United States, the Patriot systems, the so-called ATACMS, these are long-range missile systems, but also from countries like Germany that has very sophisticated long-range systems called the Tauruses that Ukrainians have been lobbying for a long time. So until the alliance, meaning Europe and the United States, don't fully see this as a war against NATO, as a war against us, which is how Mr. Putin, of course, sees it, I'm afraid we're not really going to see the kind of military support that Ukraine needs to turn this around.
Yeah, really sobering assessment. I think you're spot on, though. Alina Polyakova, as always, thank you so much for joining us.